Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good one, and welcome back to World of Warships with Rear Admiral Jingles, where today, on the Okinawa match in this Tier 9 domination battle, we're going to be joining Matakawa here in the US Navy Premium Tier 9 destroyer, the USS Benham. The Benham has been featured a few times on this channel. It probably doesn't need too much of an introduction. Suffice to say, it is an extremely good destroyer. Its strength, however, unlike most American destroyers, does not lie in its guns. The Benham's all about the torpedoes. Individually, these torpedoes are, well, they're not special. I mean, they're definitely not bad. They have a range of 10.5 kilometers, speed of 65 knots. They'll do 15,200 damage before torpedo damage reduction. They're not bad. But the strength of the Benham's torpedoes is in the number that they can put into the water at any one time. This ship has 4 torpedo launchers, 2 on each side, and each launcher is capable of launching 4 torpedoes. So this ship, if you're prepared to work the rudder a little, is capable of putting 16 torpedoes in the water at the same time. Except that's not quite true. Except, well, that's not strictly true. It's actually far worse than that. Well, if you're on the enemy team, it's far worse than that. Because with a range of 10.5 kilometers and a speed of 65 knots, in combination with the extremely good 85-second base reload on these torpedoes, which of course you can improve through skills and equipment, it's actually possible to have 32 of these torpedoes in the water at the same time, because the torpedo tubes will have reloaded before the first set of torpedoes have reached their maximum distance. The torpedoes are really the only good thing about the Benham. Everything else about the ship is either okay or kinda bad. Let's talk about the kinda bad first, get it out of the way. Benham's hit point pool is pathetic. She starts off with 14,500 hit points, which is just terrible. You're definitely going to want to take the survivability expert skill, as Matakawa has here, in order to buff that up to something that's not completely terrible, but still not terribly good. I mean, 17,500 hit points is still pretty bad, even after taking the survivability expert skill. By way of comparison, the other 2 American Tier 9 destroyers, the Fletcher and the Black, both get 17,100 hit points before you start messing around with commander skills, and if you were to add the survivability expert skill, they both top out at more than 20,000 hit points. Which kind of brings us on to our next not particularly good thing about the Benham, its stealth. For such a tiny little lollyboat with so few hit points, why is its stealth so bad? I mean, it's not terrible, but it's definitely not good. With the concealment expert skill and the tier 8 plus concealment mod fitted, he's managed to get the stealth down to a not completely terrible 5.9 kilometers. But it's just not completely terrible. I mean, it's the worst of any Tier 9 American destroyer. I mean, I could give you a list. Suffice to say, it's worse than most, better than some. Then there are the guns, and this is actually quite good timing because he's using them for the first time, now that he's safe inside this borrowed smokescreen. Benham has 4 of those good old-fashioned American 127mm 38 caliber, in this case Mark 30 guns. And they're pretty much exactly the same guns that the American destroyers have been using since the Farragut at Tier 6. What this means, to all practical intents and purposes, is that with only 4 of these guns, Benham's DPM sucks donkey balls. The only other Tier 9 destroyer that the Benham could expect to defeat in a straight-up gunfight is the Yugamo, that well-known gunboat terror of the seas at Tier 9. And even then, the Benham can only just expect to beat the Yugamo in a gunfight. Its gun DPM is that bad. That's not to say that these are bad guns. I mean, these are essentially the same guns that every other American destroyer uses. The Fletcher manages just fine on these guns, the Gearing manages just fine on these guns, but the Fletcher and the Gearing have more of them and they fire faster, with something like a base 3-second reload compared to the Benham's 3.3-second reload. So, yeah, don't be relying on your guns to get you out of trouble in the Benham, unless the enemy is either nearly dead or hasn't seen you and you get the first couple of salvos in first, and preferably both. One final thing, the Benham does get a choice of consumables. You can see that Matakawa here has gone for the engine boost as his last consumable. He could have used defensive anti-aircraft fire instead. However, he has very wisely chosen not to, and he is not going to regret that decision despite the fact that he is in a battle with a carrier on the enemy team, because the Benham's AA sucks, and taking the defensive AA consumable, which is a weak choice most of the time anyway, is merely polishing a turd. So, engine boost it is. So, crappy consumables, terrible gun DPM, not particularly good stealth, lousy hit point pool, and only 19mm of armour everywhere. Do the Benham's torpedoes make up for that litany of mediocrity? In a word, hell yes! Actually, that's 2 words. But hell yes! Because the Benham's torpedoes are hilarious. As you can see. The Benham is the epitome. Oh, and it's a double strike. Where was I going with this? Yes, well, you know, as you can see, the Benham is the epitome of throw enough shit at the wall, some of it is going to stick. These torpedoes are totally worth it. Because the Benham doesn't just throw a lot of shit at the wall. The Benham throws all of the shit at the wall. 32 torpedoes in the water at the same time, potentially, unless the first 2 sets of torpedoes have already hit something. This ship is hilarious. The torpedoes absolutely make up for all of the deficiencies. It's a relatively easy ship to play. Just, you know, don't do anything stupid like the friendly Shimi just did, who died in the smoke screen that's just dissipating over there, where he just sat there with his 20,000 health, waiting for 2 Georges to get close enough to his smoke to proximity detect him and then hammer him with their secondaries. Don't do that in the Benham. Well, it should go without saying that you don't want to do that in any destroyer, but you definitely don't want to do that in the Benham, because the gun DPM is not going to save you when you get proximity detected by a pair of Georges. Instead, Matakawa kept himself at range, and simply flooded the sea between himself and the oncoming battleships with as many torpedoes as humanly possible. That's what the Benham does. It does it exceptionally well. I've seen people in Benhams holding down entire flanks single-handed by doing just that. Benhams outnumbered 6-1, 20 kilometres away from the nearest friendly ship, but by simple weight of torpedo fire, slowing down an entire enemy advance to a practical standstill as they frantically try to avoid all of the torpedoes at the expense of making any actual headway. That's what the Benham does, and it does it very, very well. And if you do have to get into a gunfight with the Benham, and Matakawa doesn't actually have to get into a gunfight here, but he's going to do it anyway for 2 reasons. First, well, the Minsk is on very, very low health. He only has about 6,000 remaining. And his teammate in the Alaska has a Fiji and a Kitakazi in front of him that he's struggling to deal with. And he really didn't need the bother of having to deal with the Minsk on his flank as well. And thanks to Matakawa taking that fight, he no longer has to. He still has his smoke going. And there are enemy bombers overhead from the... is it a Chkalov, one of the new Russian carriers? Yes. And this, of course, is the Benham's biggest problem, being spotted from the air, and it's something that the Benham definitely struggles with. You saw that he got spotted for a fraction of a second there, and instantly the Kitakazi started shooting at him. Now, with some good support from the friendly Lexington, the Kitakazi is having this problem as well. Well, actually, he would have this problem anyway, even without the carrier spotting him, because he's open water gunboating against the Alaska. Matakawa gets a couple of shots off in support. Turns out to not need it, actually. The Alaska has taken care of the Kitakazi himself. Got momentarily spotted there and shot at by a... You know what, I always want to call it the Frederick Schultz. I don't know why, that's not its name, it's the Felix Schultz. Getting shot at by one of those things is... Oh, is the Fiji turning into the torpedo? It is. I think it might be turning into 2 torpedoes. Is that going to be a dead... That is a dead Fiji. That's the Kraken Unleashed.
Enemy cruiser sunk.
So that's not bad. Wait a minute, how can that be the Kraken Unleashed? He was on 3... That was a double strike, he got the Schultz as well. Well, I was going to talk about how getting shot at by a Schultz isn't actually a terrible thing. Not if you're in a destroyer anyway. I mean, it's an utter nightmare if you're in a light cruiser, because, well, This new line of German destroyers are basically light cruisers that are terrible at killing destroyers because their armour piercing is their major strength. But their AP, particularly against destroyers like the Benham, which are protected by a maximum of 19mm of armour plating, just tends to overpenetrate. And their high explosive absolutely sucks. They also have the slowest torpedoes in the world. Their armour-piercing DPM makes them a significant threat against light cruisers, but the Benham is not a light cruiser, and anyway it's completely redundant because, well, the Schultz is dead. And Matakawa is capping. Fortunately, he's got that American smoke that lasts forever. So, he doesn't have to worry about the Benham's Achilles heel being spotted from the air. And there's the cap. So, despite the fact that he sunk 5 enemy ships single-handed, and flipped one of the caps, and the team are now in possession of 2, with the rest of the team up to the north actually putting some pressure on that final cap circle, despite all of this, the team are still losing by around about 150 points. However, 2 caps under their belt, potentially about to flip a third. No, it's getting reset. Well, still, 2 caps, good. A third cap would be nice, of course, but they don't actually need it. They just need to hold on to what they have. And that's right, Akazuki. Yes, a 2.5-year-old cat knows that you don't need to win any harder than you already are. So, of course, naturally, the rest of the team up to the north are all throwing themselves into that cap circle that they don't actually need and getting themselves slaughtered. Earlier, I was talking about how the Benham is ideally suited for slowing down and stopping an enemy push on a flank all by itself. I think the best way to put that would be to say that the Benham is fantastic in defence. It's probably one of the best defensive destroyers in the game. Unfortunately, it does kind of suck a little bit on the offense, as you can see here, as Matakawa and his division mate in the Alaska, Mr. Fluffy Pig, great name by the way, attempt to chase down the enemy carrier. Fortunately, it was on low health. Even more fortunately, there was an Alaska, because if the Benham had tried to take that carrier down single-handed, it probably wouldn't have gone very well for the Benham. In fact, it didn't go very well for the Alaska. He's actually died to the carrier's torpedoes. No, dive bombers. He burnt to death. You see, the reason why the Benham kind of sucks on the offence, if you're chasing down a retreating enemy as he was doing here, is because the gun DPM is bad. He only did 3,000 damage to the carrier. Or really a defensive, ambush, or kind of area denial weapon. Because if you're chasing down a retreating target, it's next to impossible to sink a fleeing target with the torpedoes, because, well, the Chekhalov was heading away at 33 knots, the torpedoes have a 65 knot speed and a 10.5 kilometre range, which means the torpedoes have to catch up, which means they have to be launched from a much closer distance, probably around 5 kilometres, and you get spotted from 5.9 kilometres away. And you don't want to get spotted in the Benham. Ideally, you want to be sending your torpedoes against ships that are chasing you, or, like this, flooding an area that you suspect to contain enemy ships with those torpedoes, and then cackling like a maniac when your suspicions prove correct, and enemy ships run into the torpedoes that you flooded that postcode with. It's 3 against 4. The other surviving destroyer, the Shiratsuyu up to the north, was spotted and under attack. The enemy team is still 200 points ahead, and despite eating a couple of torpedoes, the Sovietsky Soyuz over there is contesting that central cap. So in effect, both teams have 1 cap circle. Both teams have the same number of points coming in, and the enemy team are 1 ship and 200 points ahead. And if they take that central cap, and honestly I don't think those torpedoes are going to hit the Sovietsky Soyuz, I think the island is in the way, the situation is going to get a lot worse before it... Wait, did he just run into the island? No. He did. Noob! Oh, God. I recorded this a couple of weeks ago, but I'd forgotten that happened. That actually came as a surprise to me, so I was as amazed by that as you probably are. Okay, right, so yeah, that's a thing that actually happened. And it was lucky that it did, because otherwise that Russian battleship would have flipped that central cap. Oh, there's somebody else in there now as well. Okay, the enemy team are still ahead, but not by as much. there is somebody flipping that cap. Now, don't know who it is. They have one submarine and two cruisers. It could be the Salmon, it could be the Carno. It's probably not the Buffalo. But the Buffalo's still probably close enough to use radar, assuming he has any charges of his radar left. Now, there is a cyclone in effect. Visibility is down to 8 kilometers. That's not actually a good thing, because it eats into your spotting advantage as a destroyer. And even if you do, like here, with the ideal circumstances, manage to spot one of those enemy cruisers while still remaining undetected, so at maximum range, 8 kilometers like this, they still know they've been spotted. They still know that there's an enemy destroyer around, and they can still use their radar. Fortunately, he spotted the Carno, and the Carno, as a French cruiser, doesn't get radar. However, even if the Carno hasn't seen those torpedoes, and he's far enough away that he probably hasn't, the fact that he was spotted, went behind the island, and then is no longer spotted should probably be... Oh, whoa, hang on, submarine, kill it! Kill it with fire! Don't let that little bugger get away. Air spotted by the carrier, good job Lexington. And there's kill number 7. Now, of course, he got spotted by the submarine, so my previous comment, or the point that I was trying to make, that if the Carno was capable of thinking and breathing at the same time, he would have known that he'd been spotted, then disappeared behind the island, and then was not spotted, so he would have known, even if he hadn't seen the torpedoes, more or less exactly where Matakawa was. But of course, all that's academic now. Matakawa did get spotted by the submarine, so they now all definitely know where he is. And the cyclone is lifting, so he's getting his spotting advantage back. And it's here where I think I can probably safely say, without too much fear of contradiction, because the team have all 3 of the caps, the Shiratsuyu up to the north has taken Alpha, uncontested. It's here where Matakawa makes his first real mistake. And this is the point where most people make their first real mistakes. You see it in every random battle. Yes, he's trying to win harder than he needs to. I'm not saying it was a mistake to torpedo the Carno, but I do think it was a mistake to shoot at the Carno. Even though the Carno's guns are all pointing the other way, and it's only the Carno's secondaries that are actually shooting at him, it was still a mistake to shoot at this ship, because his guns were never going to sink that cruiser. The torpedoes were always going to be the ones that did it. His guns did barely any damage to him. Using the guns when he was stuck on the rocks like that was a real risk. All it did was get him spotted, and there's still a Buffalo out there. And the Buffalo, if he wasn't busy shooting at the Lexington and sinking the Lexington, could easily have lobbed shells over the corner of the island over there and potentially taken Matakawa out. That was an awful risk that he did not need to take. The Carno was going to die to the torpedoes anyway. They're ahead on points. They have all 3 caps. There's only 2 minutes of the game left. He's on 200,000 damage. He wasn't spotted. He wasn't in any danger of being spotted. The Carno was going to die to the torpedoes whether he used the guns or not. It was an unnecessary risk. And that's really my only criticism. Because, you know, 8 kills. And he's going for the Buffalo, as is the Shiratsuyu. But they're going to hit 1,000 points before they get torpedoes anywhere near that guy. Doesn't mean it's not worth trying, of course, but the torpedoes are never going to get there in time. The shells might, but actually, then again, they might not. Oh well. You're just going to have to settle for nearly 200,000 damage and 8 kills, wiping out 2/3 of the enemy team single-handedly in the Tier 9 US Navy destroyer, the USS Benham. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care, folks, and I'll catch you next time.